The effects of the successful tests were immediate. There was an overwhelming demand for the defensive gear, and shipping shares began to rally. Freights, however, remained high. There was the cost of the gear to be covered, consumption of dolphins to be offset, and it would take some time before all cargo vessels could be equipped and revert to their normal courses. Meanwhile, the price of everything went up. Progress in equipment was such, however, that 6 months later it was possible for London and Washington to speak optimistically. The Prime Minister announced to the House, "The Battle of the Deeps has been won. Our ships, which we had to divert, are able once more to ply upon their usual courses. But we have seen before, and we must remember, that to win a battle is not of necessity to win a war. These menaces that have for a time played the highwayman upon our vital sea lanes and caused us such grievous losses, these menaces still remain, and as long as they remain, they are a potential danger. We cannot afford, therefore, any slackening of effort in combating them. We must use all our capacities and our wits to find out more, everything we can, about this peril that is lurking beneath our seas. For still, and in spite of the fact that we have won this battle, we know virtually nothing of it, save that it exists. No one can describe these creatures, if creatures they are. No one, so far as we know, has ever seen them. To us, here in the sunlight, these creatures of the darkness and the depths are still anonymously and amorphously those things down there. When we know more about them, their nature, their strength, and most importantly their weaknesses, when in fact we have a full view of what we are about, then we shall be able to launch our attack upon this pestilence so that, with its utter destruction, our ships and our seamen shall be free to sail upon the high seas of the world, facing only such perils as their gallant fathers faced before them." But a month later, a dozen ships of various sizes were sunk in a week. 4 of them while attempting to rescue survivors of earlier disasters. The few men who were brought safely back could tell little, but from their accounts it appeared that the dolphins had operated successfully. The other gear, for some reason, had failed to prevent the ships shaking to pieces under their feet. Official advice once more recommended that the neighbourhoods of all the greater deeps should be avoided pending further investigations. Hard on that, but with a significance that was not immediately recognized, came the news first from Safira and then from April Island. Safira, a Brazilian island in the Atlantic, lies a little south of the equator and some 400 miles southeast of the larger island of Fernando de Noronha. In that isolated spot, a population of 100 or so lived in primitive conditions, largely on its own produce, content to get along in its own way, and little interested in the rest of the world. It is said that the original settlers were a small party who, arriving on account of a shipwreck sometime in the 18th century, remained perforce. By the time they were discovered, they had settled to the island life and already become interestingly inbred. In due course, and without knowing or caring much about it, they had ceased to be Portuguese and become technically Brazilian citizens, and a token connection with their foster mother country was maintained by a ship which called at roughly 6 monthly intervals to do a little barter. Normally, the visiting ship had only to sound its siren, and the Safirans would come hurrying out of their cottages down to the minute quay where the few fishing boats lay to form a reception committee which included almost the entire population. On this occasion, however, the hoot of the siren echoed emptily back and forth in the little bay, and set the seabirds wheeling in flocks, but no Safiran appeared at the cottage doors. The ship hooted again, but still there was no sign of anyone making for the quay. There was no response whatever, save from the seabirds. The coast of Safira slopes steeply. The ship was able to approach to within a cable's length of the shore, but there was nobody to be seen. Nor, still more ominously, was there any trace of smoke from the cottage's chimneys. A boat was lowered, and a party with the mate in charge rowed ashore. They made fast to a ringbolt and climbed the stone steps up to the little quay. They stood there in a bunch, listening and wondering. There was not a sound to be heard but the cry of the seabirds and the lapping of the water. "Must have made off, the lot of them. Their boat's gone," said one of the sailors uneasily. "Huh," said the mate. He took a deep breath and gave a mighty hail as though he had greater faith in his own lungs than in the ship's siren. They listened for an answer, but none came, save the sound of the mate's voice echoing faintly back to them across the bay. "Huh," said the mate again. "Better have a look." The uneasiness which had come over the party kept them together. They followed him in a bunch as he strode towards the nearest of the small, stone-built cottages. The door was standing half open. He pushed it back. "Phew," he said. Several putrid fish decomposing on a dish accounted for the smell. Otherwise the place was tidy and, by Sephiran standards, reasonably clean. There were no signs of disorder or hasty packing up. In the inner room the beds were made up, ready to be slept in. The occupant might have been gone only a matter of a few hours, but for the fish and the lack of warmth in the turf fire ashes. In the second and third cottages there was the same air of unpremeditated absence. In the fourth they found a dead baby in its cradle in the inner room. The party returned to the ship puzzled and subdued. The situation was reported by radio to Rio. Rio, in its reply, suggested a thorough search of the island. The crew started on the task with reluctance and a tendency to keep in close groups, but as nothing fearsome revealed itself, gradually gained confidence. On the second day of their 3-day search, they discovered a party of 4 women and 6 children in 2 caves on a hillside. All had been dead for some weeks, apparently from starvation. By the end of the 3rd day, they were satisfied that if there were any living person left, he must be deliberately in hiding. It was only then, on comparing notes, that they realized also that there could not be more than a dozen sheep and 2 or 3 dozen goats left out of the island's normal flocks of some hundreds. They buried the bodies they'd found, radioed a full report to Rio, and then put to sea again, leaving Saphira with its few surviving animals to the seabirds. In due course the news came through from the agencies and won an inch or 2 of space here and there. 2 newspapers bestowed on Saphira the nickname of Marie Celeste Island, but failed at the time to inquire further into the matter. The April Island affair was set in quite a different key and might have continued undiscovered for some time but for the coincidence of official interest in the place. The interest stemmed from the existence of a group of Javanese malcontents variously described as smugglers, terrorists, communists, patriots, fanatics, gangsters or merely rebels who, whatever their true affiliations, operated upon a troublesome scale. In due course the Indonesian police had tracked them down and destroyed their headquarters, with which loss went much of the prestige which had enabled them to dominate and extort support from several square miles of territory. In the dispersal which resulted, most of the rank-and-file following melted swiftly away into more conventional occupations, but for 24 moving spirits with varying prices on their heads, disappearance was less easy. In difficult terrain and with small forces at their disposal, the Indonesian authorities did not pursue them, but awaited the arrival of the informer who, sooner or later, would be tempted by easy money. In the course of a few months, several informers applied. None, however, collected the rewards, for on each occasion the government party arrived only to find that the outlaws had moved on. After several such expeditions, informing fell off. No more was heard of the troublemakers, who seemed to have vanished for good. About a year after the dispersal, a trading steamer put into Jakarta carrying a native who had an interesting tale to tell the authorities there. He came, it appeared, from April Island, which lies south of the Sunda Strait, and at no great distance from the British possession of Christmas Island. According to him, April Island had been pursuing its normal and not very arduous life in its immemorial manner until some 6 months previously, when a party of 18 men had arrived in a small motor vessel. They had immediately introduced themselves as the new administration of the island, taken charge of the only small radio transmitter, posted up new laws and regulations, ordered that houses should be built for them, and helped themselves to wives. After the salutary shooting of a few persons who raised objections, a regime of a severely feudal type set in and was, so far as the informant knew, still in operation. Possible trouble with infrequently visiting ships was forestalled by corralling a number of the inhabitants under the muzzles of rifles as hostages. This, since the invaders' trigger fingers were well known to work with very slight provocation, had been effective, and the vessels had left again without suspecting that anything was amiss. The informant himself had succeeded in hiding a canoe and getting away by night. He'd been trying to reach the mainland in order to question the authenticity of this unpopular form of administration when he had been picked up by the steamer. A few questions, and his descriptions of the invaders satisfied the Jakarta authorities that they were once more on the track of their malcontents, and a small gunboat flying the flag of the Indonesian Republic was commissioned to deal with them. In order to minimize the risk of a number of innocent people dying by the hostage technique, the approach to April Island was made by night. Under starlight, the gunboat stole stealthily into a little-used bay which was masked from the main village by a headland. There, a well-armed party, accompanied by the informant who was to act as their guide, was put ashore with the task of taking the village by surprise. The gunboat then drew off, moved a little way along the coast, and lay in lurk behind the point of the headland until the landing party should summon her to come in and dominate the situation. 3/4 of an hour had been the length of time estimated for the party's crossing of the isthmus, and then perhaps another 10 or 15 minutes for its disposal of itself about the village. It was, therefore, with concern that after only 40 minutes had passed, the men aboard the gunboat heard the first burst of automatic fire, succeeded presently by several more. With the element of surprise lost, the commander ordered full speed ahead, but even as the boat surged forward, the sound of firing was drowned by a dull, reverberating boom. The crew of the gunboat looked at one another with raised eyebrows. The landing party had carried no higher forms of lethalness than automatic rifles and grenades. There was a pause. Then the automatic rifles started hammering again. This time it continued longer in intermittent bursts until it was ended again by a similar boom. The gunboat rounded the headland. In the dim light it was impossible to make out anything that was going on in the village 2 miles away. For the moment all there was dark. Then a twinkling broke out, and another, and the sound of firing reached them again. The gunboat, continuing at full speed, switched on her searchlight. The village and the trees behind it sprang into sudden, miniature existence. No figures were visible among the houses. The only sign of activity was some froth and commotion in the water a few yards out from the edge. Some claimed afterwards to have seen a dark, humped shape showing above the water a little to the right of it. As close inshore as she dared go, the gunboat put her engines astern and hove to in a flurry. The searchlights played back and forth over the huts and their surroundings. Everything lit by the beam had hard lines and seemed endowed with a curious glistening quality. The man on the Ehrlichans followed the beam, his fingers ready on the triggers. The light made a few more slow sweeps and then stopped. It was trained on several submachine guns lying on the sand, close to the water's edge. A stentorian voice from the hailer called the landing party from cover. Nothing stirred. The searchlight roved again, prying between the huts among the trees. Nothing moved there. The patch of light slid back across the beach and steadied upon the abandoned arms. The silence seemed to deepen. The commander refused to allow landing until daylight. The gunboat dropped anchor. She rode there for the rest of the night, her searchlight making the village look like a stage set upon which at any moment the actors might appear, but never did. When there was full daylight, the first officer with a party of 5 armed men rowed cautiously ashore under cover from the ship's Ehrlichans. They landed close to the abandoned arms and picked them up to examine them. All the weapons were covered with a thin slime. The men put them in the boat and then washed their hands clean of the stuff. The beach was scored in 4 places by broad furrows leading from the water's edge towards the huts. They were something over 8 feet wide, curved in section. The depth in the middle was 5 or 6 inches. The sand at the edges was banked up a trifle above the level of the surrounding beach. Some such track, the first officer thought, might have been left if a large boiler had been dragged across the foreshore. Examining them more closely, he decided from the lie of the sand that though one of the tracks led towards the water, the other 3 undoubtedly emerged from it. It was a discovery which caused him to look at the village with increased wariness. As he did so, he became aware that the scene which had glistened oddly in the searchlight was still glistening oddly. He regarded it curiously for some minutes without learning more. Then he shrugged. He tucked the butt of his submachine gun comfortably under his right arm, and slowly, with his eyes flicking right and left for the least trace of movement, he led his party up the beach. The village was formed of a semicircle of huts of various sizes, fringing upon an open space. And as they drew closer, the reason for the glistening look became plain. The ground, the huts themselves, and the surrounding trees too, all had a thin coating of the slime which had been on the guns. The party kept steadily, slowly on until they reached the centre of the open space. There they paused, bunched together, facing outwards, examining each foot of cover closely. There was no sound, no movement, but a few fronds stirring gently in the morning breeze. The men began to breathe more evenly. The first officer removed his gaze from the huts and examined the ground about them. It was littered with a wide scatter of small metal fragments, most of them curved, all of them shiny with the slime. He turned one over curiously with the toe of his boot, but it told him nothing. He looked about them again and decided on the largest hut. "We'll search that," he said. The whole front of it glistened stickily. He pushed the unfastened door open with his foot and led the way inside. There was little disturbance. Only a couple of overturned stools suggested a hurried exit. No one, alive or dead, remained in the place. They came out again. The first officer glanced at the next hut, then he paused and looked at it more closely. He went round to examine the side of the hut that they had already entered. The wall there was quite dry and clear of slime. He considered the surroundings again. "It looks," he said, "as if everything had been sprayed with this muck by something in the middle of the clearing." A more detailed examination supported the idea, but took them little further. "But how?" the officer asked meditatively. "Also what? And why?" "Something came out of the sea," said one of his men, looking back uneasily towards the water. "Some things. 3 of them," the first officer corrected him. They returned to the middle of the open semicircle. It was clear that the place was deserted, and there did not seem to be much more to be learned there at present. "Collect a few of these bits of metal. They may mean something to somebody," the officer instructed. He himself went across to one of the huts, found an empty bottle, scraped some of the slime into it and corked it up. "This stuff's beginning to stink now the sun's getting at it," he said on his return. "We might as well clear out. There's nothing we can do here." Back on board, he suggested that a photographer should take pictures of the furrows on the beach and showed the commander his trophies, now washed clean of the slime. "Queer stuff," he said, holding a piece of the thick, dull metal. "A shower of it around." He tapped it with a knuckle. "Sounds like lead, weighs like feathers. Cast, by the look of it. Ever seen anything like that, sir?" The commander shook his head. He observed that the world seemed to be full of strange alloys these days. Presently the photographer came rowing back from the beach. The commander decided, "We'll give 'em a few more blasts on the siren. If nobody shows up in half an hour, we better make a landing some other place and find a local inhabitant who can tell us what the hell goes on." A couple of hours later, the gunboat cautiously nosed her way into a bay on the northeast coast of April Island. A similar, though smaller, village stood there in a clearing, close to the water's edge. The similarity was uncomfortably emphasized by an absence of life, as well as by a beach displaying 4 broad furrows to the water's edge. Closer investigation, however, showed some differences. Of these furrows, 2 had been made by some objects ascending the beach, the other 2 by, apparently, the same objects descending it. There was no trace of the slime either, in or about the deserted village. The commander frowned over his charts. He indicated another bay. "All right, we'll try there then," he said. This time there were no furrows to be seen on the beach, though the village was just as thoroughly deserted. Again the gunboat's siren gave a forlorn, unheeded wail. They examined the scene through glasses. Then the first officer, scanning the neighbourhood more widely, gave an exclamation. "There's a fellow up on that hill there, sir, waving a shirt or something." The commander turned his own glasses that way. 2 or 3 others a bit to the left of him, too. The gunboat gave a couple of hoots and moved closer inshore. The boat was lowered. "Stand off a bit till they come," the commander directed. "Find out whether there's been an epidemic of some kind before you try to make contact." He watched from his bridge. In due course, a party of natives, 8 or 9 strong, appeared from the trees a couple of 100 yards east of the village and hailed the boat. It moved in their direction. Some shouting and counter-shouting between the two parties ensued. Then the boat went in and grounded on the beach. The first officer beckoned the natives with his arm, but they hung back in the fringe of the trees. Eventually, the first officer jumped ashore and walked across the strand to talk to them. An animated discussion took place. Clearly, an invitation to some of them to visit the gunboat was being declined with vigour. Presently, the first officer descended the beach alone, and the landing party headed back. "What's the trouble there?" the commander inquired as the boat came alongside. The first officer looked up. "They won't come, sir." "What's the matter with them?" "They're okay themselves, sir, but they say the sea isn't safe." "Well, they can see it's safe enough for us. What do they mean?" "They say several of the shore villages have been attacked, and they think theirs may be at any moment." "Attacked? What by?" Perhaps you'd come and talk to them yourself, sir. I sent a boat so that they could come to me. That ought to be good enough for them." "I'm afraid they'll not come, short of force, sir." The commander frowned. "That scared, are they?" "What's been doing this attacking?" The first officer moistened his lips. His eyes avoided his commander's. They say whales, sir." The commander stared at him. "They say what?" he demanded. The first officer looked unhappy. I know, sir, but that's what they keep on saying. Whales and giant jellyfish. I really think that if you'd speak to them yourself, sir." The news about April Island did not exactly break in the accepted sense. A curious going-on an atoll which could not even be found in most atlases had, on the face of it, little news value, and the odd line or two which recorded the matter was allowed to slip past. Possibly it would not have attracted attention or been remembered until much later, if at all, but for the chance that an American journalist who happened to be in Jakarta discovered the story for himself, took a speculative trip to April Island, and wrote the affair up for a weekly magazine. A pressman reading it recalled the Sapphira incident, linked the two, and splashed a new peril across a Sunday newspaper. It happened that this preceded by one day the most sensational communiqué yet issued by the Standing Committee for Action, with the result that the deeps had the big headlines once more. Moreover, the term deeps was more comprehensive than formerly, for it was announced that shipping losses in the last month had been so heavy, and the areas in which they had occurred so much more extensive, that, pending the development of more efficient means of defence, all vessels were strongly advised to avoid crossing deep water and keep, as far as was practical, to the areas of the continental shelves. It was obvious that the committee would not have dealt such a blow to recovering confidence in shipping without the gravest reasons. Nevertheless, the answering outburst of indignation from the shipping interests accused it of everything from sheer alarmism to a vested interest in airlines. To follow such advice, they protested, would mean routing transatlantic liners into Iceland and Greenland waters, creeping coastwise down the Bay of Biscay and the West African coast, etc. Trans-Pacific commerce would become impossible, and Australia and New Zealand isolated. It showed a shocking and lamentable lack of a sense of responsibility that the committee should be allowed to advise in this way, and without full consultation with all interested parties, these panic-inspired measures which would, if heeded, bring the maritime commerce of the world virtually to a stop. Advice which could never be implemented should never have been given. The committee hedged slightly under the attack. It had not ordered, it said, it had simply suggested that wherever possible, vessels should attempt to avoid crossing any extensive stretch of water where the depth was greater than 2,000 fathoms, and thus avoid exposing itself to danger unnecessarily. This, retorted the shipowners curtly, was virtually putting the same thing in different words, and their case, though not their cause, was upheld by the publication in almost every newspaper of sketch maps showing hurried and somewhat varied impressions of the 2,000-fathom line. Before the committee was able to re-express itself in still different words, the Italian liner Sabina and the German liner Vorpommern disappeared on the same day, the one in mid-Atlantic, the other in the South Atlantic, and reply became superfluous. The news of the latest sinking was announced on the 8 a.m. news bulletin on a Saturday. The Sunday papers took full advantage of their opportunity. At least 6 of them slashed at official incompetence with almost 18th century gusto and set the pitch for the dailies. The Times screwed down rebukes to make the juice run out. The Guardian's approach was similar in intention, but more like an advancing set of circular saws in manner. The News Chronicle's was not unlike, though with the teeth set slightly wider apart. The Express turned its hammer from the forging of imperial links to flailing those whose ineptitudes were now weakening them. The Mail denounced the failure to rule the seas as supreme treachery and demanded the impeachment of the saboteurs, omissive and commissive. The Herald told the housewife that the price of food would rise. The Worker, after pointing out that in a properly ordered society such tragedies would have been impossible since luxury liners would not exist and therefore could not be sunk, rounded upon owners who drove seamen into danger in unprotected ships at inadequate wages.
The Kraken Wakes was written by John Wyndham and read by Stephen Moore. The programme was produced in Belfast by Susan Carson.